So far, we've talked about attention quite a bit. Now, I think we should talk about memory. As a reminder, you can think about this figure here a little bit, and on the left-hand side we have stimulation coming in from our environment. It's stored briefly in a sensory register or sensory memory. We perceive that information, that is, we kind of recognize it and make sense of it by combining attention with some knowledge and long-term memory, and now it moves on to working memory, which is that stuff we can think about at any one period of time. That working memory is kind of a combination of what we've recently perceived as well as knowledge that we have in long-term memory, but it's that kind of information that we're thinking about right this moment. That, of course, requires attention too, to keep in working memory. That is, if we want to keep something in mind, we have to attend to it. We can do a lot of things with information in working memory. For example, we can think about it, we can make decisions, we can manipulate it, all of those kinds of things. And then eventually, we figure out what to do about it. That is, we may choose some type of response here, and that's in the response selection area. That, of course, requires attention as well. And then finally, we execute that response, which also requires attention. And that's what we get. Of course, that feeds back to provide more information in our sensory register, and it starts all over again with a nice feedback loop. There's actually three components to memory, or three processes, really, is what the way to think about it. There's encoding, which is getting information into memory to begin with. What that means is converting the information into a form that's usable by memory, basically making neural impulses out of it. And that in itself demands attention. Then there's storage, that is retaining information once you've gotten it into memory, keeping it around, and then finally retrieval, bringing that information back one at a time when we need it. And that's influenced by a number of things. All of these things are influenced by attention, but certainly retrieval ends up getting interfered with quite a bit when we're under sort of high stress demand situations. So let's talk a little bit about working memory. That's this component right here. That really is, working memory is kind of our contents of our awareness. So most recently perceived information and the relevant contents of long-term memory is what goes into our working memory, and you can see that here. So here's our working memory. That's where we can do thinking and decision making and all of those kinds of things. Stuff that we've recently perceived as well as information that we've recently retrieved from long-term memory. That is, those are the contents of our working memory. And that working memory is pretty darn important. It enables us to, think about things consciously, to make calculations, to make judgments, to compare things, to predict. It does an awful lot for us. Really, working memory is what we think about when we think about thinking. Typically, when we think about what we're doing when we're thinking about that kind of information that we can hold in mind and basically the contents of our awareness. The problem with working memory, there's a couple actually. One is it can hold only a small amount of information at any one period of time, and that information only sticks around for a very brief period of time. It tends to be fragile. That is, new information tends to push it out. So in order for us to keep that information in working memory, we have to pay attention to it, sometimes rehearse it, operate on it, those kinds of things for it to stick around. Otherwise, other kinds of information, other kinds of awareness tends to push it out and fill in the blanks. So as I mentioned, working memory has both a small capacity, that is, it can only hold a little bit of information at a time, and a pretty small duration. That is, the information that's in there only sticks around a little bit of time. Probably the most famous paper on the capacity of working memory was by George Miller in 1956, where he inspected several studies and reached the conclusion that the average person could hold about 7 plus or minus 2 items in working memory. Follow-on studies and reviews, for example, by Baddeley and Cowan and others, estimate that working memory capacity may be closer to 4 items. So you can see that it is not a lot And as a result, it represents a real bottleneck for us in terms of our cognitive abilities. We can only hold a little bit of information in there at any one time. On the other hand, it's hard to know exactly. Remember, we talked about 7 plus or minus 2 items. It's hard to know exactly what represents an item. So, for example, imagine we were coming up with letters and we just came up with M, B, and I. Those aren't particularly meaningful to you, those letters M, B, and I. So each letter, because it's not very meaningful to you, each one probably represents its own item in working memory. They would fill 3 of our 4 or so slots in working memory. So our working memory starts filling up pretty fast. But what if we just reordered that to the sequence to be IBM? So now if you're familiar with IBM, the company, suddenly that's not 3 different slots any longer. IBM is IBM. We can picture the company. So that might just be 1 slot there. You might add in AT&T and HP and BP and others. Each one of those letters then don't become a separate slot or a separate item in working memory, but the companies themselves become that. That is, we have basically chunked that information. So that's the idea behind chunking, and you'll hear about chunking a lot. It's to take information that's not yet categorized and kind of put it together so it forms a meaningful whole. And when you put it together into a meaningful whole, well, then that means it's kind of just one item now. You've itemized it. And now that you've done that, that just takes up kind of 1 slot of our 4 or our 7, depending on who you believe, of our working memory capacity. So an important part of our jobs as learners and as cognitive beings is to figure out how to categorize things and how to chunk things accordingly. Interestingly, that means your part as a good designer is going to be spent trying to figure out what's the best way to chunk things, what's the best way to categorize them so that they're meaningful to people and we don't overwhelm their working memory. In fact, people end up being really good categorizers. That is, they do it kind of spontaneously, often without thinking very much at all. Categorization is kind of like chunking, enabling us to remember more by placing things in related categories. And that's a big part of what information architecture is all about. So the folks who do information architecture, that is laying out where information is in a system, knowing what to name various items and what to name buttons and things like that, that is in many ways knowing how to categorize things well. People in particular have a natural tendency to form hierarchical categories to make sense of the world and kind of increase our working memory. So people tend to sort of default to a hierarchical organization of information. It makes it easier for them to remember items that way. And in fact, a portion of our prefrontal cortex, one of the most recently developed components of our brains, is dedicated to this task of kind of partitioning out long events into chunks. So I told you working memory doesn't have a very high capacity. You can only fit a little bit of information in there at a time. On the other hand, if you chunk things, you can probably fit a bit more. The other bummer about working memory is the information that's in there does not stick around too terribly long. So it really provides kind of temporary storage for us. And the contents of working memory tend to decay pretty quickly. So here's an old study from Peterson and Peterson in 1959. They gave 3 letters at a time to people. They would tell them what letters like XPJ or BTP or something like that, and they would ask them to recall those letters. And then they found the ability to remember the 3 letters got worse the longer they waited between learning and testing. So, for example, but it wasn't like they waited a really long time. We're talking about on the order of seconds. So you can see after about 3 seconds, people were pretty darn good at recalling, about 80% of the 3-letter items. On the other hand, just waiting an extra 6 seconds so that it's 9 now instead of 3, really dropped that down to about 31 or 32. If we waited about 18 seconds, that's not terribly long. Suddenly, people were way down around remembering about 10% of those letter sequences. So it tells us that working memory does not last long at all. And for us to work and keep information in working memory, we need to do things like pay attention to it, rehearse it, all of those kinds of things. The other thing you can do as a designer is make sure that information is always visible so people don't have to remember things. One of the things I'm going to try to encourage you to do as designers is do everything you possibly can to be really kind to people's memories. Their memories, as you can see, don't have high capacity, don't have long duration, and they're fragile when they get interrupted. So given such a fragile system, one of the nicest things you can do for your designers is figure out ways to be really kind to their memory, to show them just the right information at the right time, and to make it so that they don't have to remember things between screens, for example. I think some things we can do, of course. I always thought this was interesting. So as I mentioned, contents in working memory decay pretty quickly. Because of that, people tend to remember short words, not worlds, that should say words, short words better than longer ones. In fact, our ability to recall diminishes as the time required to say the word gets longer. People remember only as many words as they can say in about 2 seconds. Pretty amazing, right? So people don't remember much more than that. So in your designs, please try to keep the names of functions as short as possible without introducing confusion. So I talked about all these things, didn't I? Working memory is fragile, it requires attention, it gets disrupted, it requires mental effort. Boy, I think I described all those things. Now, here's another interesting thing about working memory. You know, the information in working memory is kind of stored in various ways. If you think about the word cat, for example, and you kind of commit that to your working memory, right? You're thinking about it right now, cat. You might have a visual representation in your working memory of cat. Maybe it's an image of a cat and the word cat. You might have a semantic representation, knowledge about cats. You know, maybe cats have bad attitudes. You remember that. But you'll also have a phonetic representation, actually the sound of the word cat. And in working memory, that phonetic representation is particularly strong. When we hear the word cat or see the word cat when we're reading it, we tend to say that to ourselves, subvocally basically. We don't say it out loud because that would be weird, but we say it to ourselves, and that tends to stick around for a little bit of time in working memory. Sometimes if we ask people what the word was afterwards, especially if you've given them an intervening task or something, basically they'll come out with rhyming words. They'll say things like, oh yeah, it was hat or sat or pat. Basically, we're more likely to confuse letters and words that sound alike than words and letters that do not sound alike. So this tells you things like items and labels on your device, as much as possible, should have different sounding names, not just different appearing names, but different sounding names, because we have this tendency to say things to ourselves subvocally when we are reading them. So avoid, if at all possible, names or labels that rhyme, because people do have a tendency, surprising as it is, to confuse those things. Now here's another one that's worth knowing about memory. It's called the serial position effect. You may be familiar with this a bit already, but imagine you're required to memorize a long list of words. It'll turn out that typically if you have to repeat those back to us after a certain period of time, you'll be particularly good at remembering the ones in the beginning and particularly good at remembering the ones at the end. The ones in the middle, on the other hand, you won't be very good at all. And that is often referred to as the serial position effect. That is the position in the order. So we tend to recall the first few words and the last few words in a list better than the ones in the middle. The part where we're good at remembering the first ones, we often refer to that as the primacy effect. That is, the first words are prime, we tend to remember that, and that's the primacy effect. The last words, which we're also good at, we often refer to as the recency effect. So it's those ones in the middle. In fact, many people have talked about this, storytellers, for years. talked about, if you're going to tell a story, it's really important that you start well and that you end well. What happens in the middle, it's okay, it's important, but nothing as important as if you start really well and you end really well, because that tends to be the things that people remember. So what this means for you as a designer probably is that this tells you the most important items in a list should probably be placed at the beginning. One of the reasons is, I didn't tell you this part, but the primacy effect tends to stick around longer than the recency effect does. So again, that suggests if you really want people to pay attention to something, you should put those items at the beginning, one of the first few items. Okay, I think I have told you some important stuff about working memory. Again, it stores very little information at a time. We can chunk that information, that helps us. The material decays quickly, that is, we don't have a very long duration there. If we focus our attention on working memory, that keeps it active, so that's important. But as soon as you take that attention away, you're out of luck. Basically, that information tends to get lost. Newly added items tend to vie for our limited attention, and that kicks out the old items. And of course, our working memory capacity, that is how much we can remember, decreases, especially under things like stress. So if you're designing a system where a person is likely to be stressed at certain times, well, then that's something you're going to have to be really careful of. And I want you to always go out of your way to be kind to people's memories. There's another type of memory that's worth talking about, and this is prospective memory. This is memory to do something in the future. So you've probably experienced this before where you've missed an appointment, you forgot that you were supposed to go to the appointment. That is, you've forgotten that to do something that was in the future. That's called prospective memory. And this tends to be improved by things like reminders and checklists and things like that. In healthcare, they'll often have people use checklists together. The same thing with aviation, with one person reading the checklist and the second person checking the items to make sure they've actually been completed. That's, as I mentioned, the case in aviation and space flight and so forth. I think it really helps, however, if these checklists, if you pay as much attention to the checklist in designing that as you do in designing everything else. A checklist is also a user interface, and that deserves design attention as well. So take advantage of chunking items by stage or by role. Use familiar but short terms, because our working memory, as we said before, has a tendency to remember what we can say in about 2 seconds. And design that checklist to be quick and completed as quickly as possible. Now let's talk about long-term memory. That's this area down here. That's the stuff that includes knowledge and skills and all of those kinds of things that we carry around with us for our entire lives. So some information in working memory will be rehearsed quite a bit. It'll be used quite a bit, and it'll become well enough known to transfer to long-term memory. Long-term memory has a huge capacity and a very, very long duration. Some people have argued that once information is in long-term memory, you never forget it. I don't know that that's true, but it gives you an idea of exactly how long we're talking about. And it includes knowledge of facts and skills and events, like episodes, things that happened in your past that you can remember for a very long time. That information in long-term memory tends to be contextually oriented. That is, information in long-term memory tends to be stored according to relatedness. So, if you tend to think about a cat, you automatically tend to think about other things about a cat. So, for example, you might think about a dog too, because cats are kind of related to dogs in the sense that they're, well, somewhat opposite, but also they're both house pets. You might remember other things about cats. You might remember that, I need cat food. You might remember that the cat hasn't gone out. All of those kinds of things. The reason is because we tend to store knowledge in in long-term memory in kind of networks, so that related information tends to be stored right next to other information that's related. So long-term memory arranges information according to meaning, so that related topics are close to each other in memory. And because of this reliance on meaning and association, we remember better when we're reminded by something related, something in context. I'll give you an example of this. Oh gosh. You know what? I'm not going to give you an example of this because the example I came up with was not a great one. Let's move on to the next part. Okay, now I'm going to ask you to do something here. Memorize these words. I'll leave it up for about 10 seconds. Okay, now write down as many of those as you possibly can. I'll give you some time to do that. Now, good, I suppose you've done that. Do the following. Try to remember as many of these words as you can. Memorize these words. Okay. Write down as many of those as you can. Okay, finally, memorize these words. And write down as many of those as you can. Okay, now, if you're like most people, chances are you were able to memorize the first bunch of words better than the second bunch of words. Not everybody does that, but typically that's the common thing that you see. And then both of those tend to be better than the third. And it's telling for a couple of reasons. So we're able to remember the first things for two reasons. One, they're meaningful, right? We can look at those things and kind of picture them. That's true somewhat of the second one. That is, those are meaningful too, but we have a little bit harder time picturing them. It's a little harder to picture belief and mercy and things like that than it is the things that we had, flower and so forth, that we had shown in the first one. And because it's not as visualizable, it's a little bit harder for us to remember. The stuff that was third, well, we're not good at memorizing things that have very little meaning at all. So those last ones, we're not very good at that. And of course, it's really hard to picture those things because we don't even know what in the world they are. So those things tend to be particularly difficult. So this tells you a few things. As you're designing, it really helps to be able to use words and things like that that are visualizable. So be able to use visualizable or kind of concrete words as much as possible, and avoid words that are a little bit more ambiguous, a little bit more fluffy, because people have a more difficult time remembering things like that. Okay. I'm going to have you just look at this video when you get a chance. I thought it was pretty interesting and kind of humorous, and I'm just going to pass over it for the time being. So we've talked quite a bit about memory, and I should mention a few other things. I think we kind of covered this about memory. Yep, I think we're good there. I think I'm going to pass these up too. I think some things that we can do to improve our designs and reduce memory demands are to recall that people forget easily between screens, or even sometimes within the same screen when related information is kind of far away, so that they're kind of have to scan or find a piece of information while they were looking at something else. People also tend to lose their memory a bit when performing complex tasks with lots of information, or when they get distracted. People tend to remember better, however, when we adhere to their expectancies in terms of our designs. That is, when they have a prior idea of where an item is located, they have a much better time finding it and remembering it. And of course, we should do things like take advantage of people's prior mental models. Mental models are really just memory representations. So using familiar stimuli, meaningful fonts and icons, words rather than abbreviations, all help people remember things better. The other thing we can do is provide sort of information in the world. That is, make it so that people don't have to remember everything. Instead, we can put the information as much as possible in front of them. We can do that by allowing side-by-side comparisons. We could do something like this, which is just kind of a demonstration that helps people have in front of them how to tie a tie instead of having to, go watch a video and then try to remember what the video said. Basically, this ends up sort of speeding that up. So this is kind of a checklist. Also, when I talked about information in the world, the book also talks about this, but we talk a little bit about affordances and signifiers. And affordances are those things that we know by looking at something what we can do with it. That is, it enables us to figure out, okay, what are all the actions that I can do with a particular thing? So I'm sitting here at a desk. That desk is horizontal. I know that I can put my computer on it. I know I can rest my elbow on it. I know I can write a sheet of paper on that desk because it's nice and flat and so forth. Sometimes user interfaces don't have those obvious affordances, those obvious cues or clues that tell us what something can be used for. So when that's the case, we have to provide something else, which is kind of a signifier. That is some kind of sign that tells people how something works or what they can do about it. This is a product I worked on years ago, which is a paper towel dispenser that's hands-free. And we ended up adding this basic hand that looks like it's waving to you right in front of it. And the reason was, in observational research, we recognized that people had no earthly idea, this was some time ago, how to use these newfangled hands-free paper towel dispensers. What you're supposed to do is put yourself in front of it, and it will detect that you're there, or it'll detect your hands and it'll kick out a sheet of paper. So what we had to do, of course, was to go with this kind of design where you actually wave your hand in front of it, and that is what's called a signifier. There was no natural affordance that told you you're supposed to wave your hand, so we had to add in a sign that tells them to do that, and that sign, that's what you call a signifier. It makes the affordance kind of obvious. Okay, I hope you found that helpful, and I look forward to talking to you next time.